All right, let's jump into this. We've had a lot of listeners asking us to do a deep dive on the Indian Army. Their weapons, the tough conditions they operate under, and of course their relationship with China. And we found this really fascinating interview with Colonel Shivinder Kanwar. He's a retired Indian Army Special Forces officer, and he spoke with Raj Shamani on his YouTube channel. He gave some really insightful answers to some, well, pretty tough questions.
Interesting. Yeah, I've heard of that channel. So what kind of things did he talk about? What stood out to you?
One of the first things that caught my attention was how he described the intense training for the Indian Army Special Forces. I mean, we're talking speed marches with crazy heavy loads, sleep deprivation during Hell Week, that kind of thing. But get this, he even mentioned learning to assemble and disassemble weapons blindfolded.
Wow, that's intense. But I guess it makes sense when you think about it. Special forces training around the world, it's all designed to push soldiers to their absolute limits. It's not just about physical strength. They need to be able to adapt and be resilient under incredible pressure.
Absolutely, and it sounds like resourcefulness is another key trait. Colonel Kanwar mentioned that he often had to purchase his own gear. Things like specific rucksacks for different mission lengths, just using his own money to supplement the standard issue equipment.
That's a bit different from what we often picture with Western forces, with all their, almost unlimited resources. Makes you think about the impact on mission effectiveness and how Indian soldiers must learn to adapt and improvise.
Right, totally. He also talked about his favorite weapons, specifically the Heckler & Koch 416, the M4 carbine, and the AK-47. It seemed like he really appreciated their reliability and how effective they are in all kinds of combat situations.
Oh, that's really interesting. Those are some pretty iconic weapons. The Heckler & Koch 416 is known for its accuracy. It's popular with special forces units all over the world. And the M4, well, it's super customizable. And then, of course, you have the AK-47, legendary for its simplicity and toughness. I mean, it sounds like his choices really reflect a need for weapons that are just dependable no matter what.
For sure. And that brings us to his comments about China, which were, pretty striking. He straight up said, "Nobody is afraid of China."
Whoa. Okay, that's a pretty bold statement, especially when you consider all the ongoing tensions and the media narrative, It often paints India as being very cautious, almost hesitant in its dealings with China.
Exactly. And he even compared the situation to the conflict in Ukraine, suggesting that India might actually be perceived as stronger than outsiders assume.
That's interesting. It makes you wonder how much public perception really lines up with the reality on the ground.
For sure. It does seem like he's pushing back against certain narratives. Right. He also talked about some unconventional missions, referring to a strategic bottleneck or chicken neck area, and kind of implying that certain operations go beyond what's typically discussed publicly,
Oh, the chicken neck, right. That's that narrow strip of land that connects India's northeast region to the rest of the country. It's a vital corridor, strategically speaking. Any kind of disruption there would have huge consequences. So it makes sense that this area would be, a focal point for both conventional and potentially more clandestine operations.
Yeah, and it sounds like those missions can be really intense. Colonel Kanwar described a firefight where he ended up with shrapnel injuries. He talked about the split-second decisions you have to make in combat and the lasting impact of those experiences.
It's just a stark reminder that these are real people facing real dangers, The toll that combat takes, both physically and mentally, it's something we can't underestimate. And it's important for all of us to keep in mind when we discuss these kinds of military operations. It's easy to get caught up in all the strategic analysis, but ultimately it's about human lives.
Absolutely. And speaking of complexities, he also touched upon the relationship between the Indian Army and the local population, particularly in areas like Kashmir.
Yeah, that's a critical aspect of any conflict, for sure.
He explained that support for militants can come from a lot of different places. Fear, manipulation, even genuine ideological differences. He even mentioned a grading system they use for informants, A, B, and C, and the fact that they sometimes have to pay for information.
Oh, wow, that's fascinating. I mean, relying on informants in a conflict zone like that, it always brings up ethical questions, and of course, strategic ones too. Trying to navigate those complexities, weighing the potential benefits against the risks, that's got to be a constant challenge.
Absolutely. And what's interesting? He actually drew a comparison between handling insurgents and treating a medical ailment.
Oh, go on.
He emphasized the importance of addressing the root causes, suggesting that a purely military solution might not be enough to really achieve lasting peace.
That's a thought-provoking analogy. It's just a much more holistic approach, right?
Right.
Recognizing that military force alone might not be enough to win over hearts and minds.
Right, exactly. And despite all the challenges and dangers he faced, Colonel Kanwar ended this part of the interview on a kind of hopeful note. He shared a story about being recognized and helped by civilians while he was traveling in civilian clothes. He really stressed the strong sense of patriotism among Indian civilians and their support for the Army.
That's a really powerful anecdote. It speaks to that idea that even amidst conflict, even with all the complexities, there's this bond between the military and the people they protect.
For sure. It really does. So are you ready to dive into the rest of this interview?
Absolutely, I'm hooked.
Okay, let's do it. Okay, so picking up where we left off, Colonel Kanwar had this, well, pretty provocative thought to share. He actually believes that every Indian citizen should serve in the Army for at least 1 to 2 years.
Wow, mandatory military service. That's a big idea. I can only imagine the impact that would have on Indian society as a whole, both for individuals and for civil-military relations.
It really is. It's a bold idea. Makes you think about what would happen if a whole generation experienced that, the discipline, the camaraderie, and of course, all the challenges that come with military life.
Yeah, you wonder if it would create a stronger sense of national unity. But then on the other hand, would it potentially lead to a more militarized society? It's a lot to consider, how those shared experiences, especially ones as intense as military service, shape a nation's values,
Right, totally. And just thinking about it from an individual perspective, imagine being thrown into that environment, constantly pushed outside your comfort zone, physically and mentally.
It would definitely force you to learn a lot about yourself, that's for sure. Resilience, teamwork, adaptability. Colonel Kanwar seems to believe that those values, learned through military service, would benefit people in all aspects of life.
He did. And he even talked about compassion developing from that experience, which might seem kind of counterintuitive given the nature of his work. But he described this powerful moment, sharing a simple meal with his comrades, knowing that they could be sent into a life-or-death situation at any moment.
Yeah, there's a certain weight to that, a shared sense of purpose and understanding of mortality. It makes you appreciate life in a way that most people never do.
Absolutely. He also talked about maintaining a professional demeanor, even when faced with, horrific situations. He described an operation where he had to eliminate a target. And he acknowledged that on the other side, that individual was also fighting for survival.
It's a chilling reminder that every conflict involves human beings on both sides. It's easy to dehumanize the enemy, but soldiers on the ground, they see things differently.
They do. He talked about seeing the fear, the desperation, sometimes even a glimmer of regret. It's such a contrast to the black and white narratives we often hear from politicians or the media.
Yeah, and that perspective from those who actually seen combat. It's so crucial for understanding the true cost of war. It goes way beyond winning or losing. It's about the lasting scars, both physical and emotional.
Right. Colonel Kanwar's own experiences are a testament to that. He described being caught in a firefight, sustaining shrapnel injuries, and having to push through excruciating pain to complete the mission. The human capacity for endurance is incredible. But you can't help but wonder about the long-term effects of those kinds of experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a collective sacrifice that extends far beyond the battlefield. We have to think about the families back home, too,
Yeah.
carrying the weight of worry and uncertainty.
Exactly. So bringing it back to this idea of mandatory military service, would a broader understanding of those sacrifices, those complexities, would it change how we approach conflict as a society?
That's a good question. Would we be more hesitant to engage in military action? If we knew that our own children, siblings, friends could be the ones on the front lines? Or would it create a deeper sense of responsibility, a stronger commitment to pursuing peaceful resolutions?
It's hard to say, right? Those are profound questions. And there are no easy answers. But Colonel Kanwar's insights definitely give us a valuable starting point for exploring the human dimension of warfare. They give us a glimpse into all the factors that shape how we perceive conflict and how we engage with it.
He also talked about the challenges of intelligence gathering, didn't he? In such a volatile environment, it's not just about collecting information. It's about sifting through all the noise, trying to figure out what's real, what's actionable.
He did. He actually recounted the situation where they got a tip about a militant hiding in a house. And while the information turned out to be accurate, the operation itself, it was anything but straightforward.
Sounds intense.
It was. He described the tension of searching that house, knowing the target was inside, but not knowing exactly where. The need for absolute certainty before engaging. The pressure of making split-second decisions in a life-or-death situation, it's palpable in his account.
And didn't that operation take a dangerous turn?
It did. He ended up face-to-face with a militant. Gunfire erupted, and he had to jump out of a window to escape.
Wow, that sounds chaotic and incredibly dangerous.
It was, and it's in those moments that his training really kicks in. That focus on physical and mental resilience. He talked about how he continued to engage the target even after being wounded, by a grenade no less, driven by instinct, the will to survive, but also maintaining the discipline to control his emotions, to stay tactically aware.
It's a gripping account of what combat is really like. It just emphasizes that it's not just about physical ability or tactical skills. It's about mental toughness, being able to compartmentalize fear and just focus on the mission, even when your own life is on the line.
And he also shed light on the use of informants in these kinds of operations, building relationships with locals, often relying on people driven by a mix of fear, financial gain, maybe even a desire for revenge.
It's a complicated world.
It is. He talked about one informant in particular who had provided some vital information, but it turned out that her husband had been killed by militants because he had been an informant.
Oh, wow. That just highlights the cyclical nature of violence, doesn't it? The deeply personal stakes involved.
It really does. He went on to explain the grading system they use for informants, A, B, and C, and the fact that they often have to pay for information.
It's a glimpse into a morally ambiguous world where those lines can get blurry in the pursuit of information.
It raises some important questions about the nature of warfare in a gray zone, right? When the traditional rules of engagement don't always apply, how do we balance the need for intelligence with the ethical implications of using informants?
Especially when some of those informants might be coerced or driven by personal vendettas.
It's a complicated issue, and Colonel Canwar doesn't try to offer simple answers. He just presents the realities as he's experienced them and forces us to grapple with those uncomfortable truths about conflict and the difficult choices faced by those on the front lines.
There's a lot to unpack there. Where do you think we should go next with this?
I think it would be really valuable to explore his views on China a little more. That earlier comment about not being afraid of China, it definitely piqued my interest. I'm eager to understand his perspective better.
Yeah, let's do that. This is turning into a really insightful deep dive. You're right. Let's dig a little deeper into those views on China. I mean, that statement he made, nobody is afraid of China. It seems to contradict a lot of what we hear, about India being hesitant in their dealings with China.
Totally. So he went on to explain that India isn't intimidated by China at all, and that they're fully prepared to defend their interests. He even used this analogy, saying that violence is only stopped by greater violence.
That's a pretty stark statement. It kind of reflects a core principle of military doctrine, though, right? Project Strength. Show a willingness to respond forcefully, and hopefully that deters aggression.
Exactly. But he also made it clear that they prioritize targeted action against actual perpetrators. He emphasized that innocent civilians are never the target. So there's a clear distinction there between measured retaliation and indiscriminate violence.
Right, maintaining that moral high ground, even in the midst of conflict.
It sounds like he's really pushing back against that perception that India is hesitant to confront China. He's saying, look, we're ready to take decisive action when necessary. He even said, we will fight hard and win.
That's a bold statement. It definitely reflects a lot of confidence in the Indian Army's capabilities. But it also makes you wonder, what does winning even look like in this kind of situation, with such a complex geopolitical landscape?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think this whole conversation highlights just how multifaceted modern warfare really is. There are so many factors at play beyond just military strength. And understanding the perspectives of those on the ground, like Colonel Canwar, it's essential.
It really challenges us to think critically about the information we're getting about global conflicts. It's easy to forget that we're often only seeing a small piece of the puzzle.
Absolutely. And he also talked about national pride, patriotism within the Indian Army, the dedication and sacrifices of Indian soldiers, their connection to their country.
It's not just talk either, right? He shared that story about traveling in civilian clothes and being recognized, and the support he received from ordinary people.
Right, it was really touching. He talked about the grueling training, the long deployments, the risk of injury or death. He didn't sugarcoat any of it, but he made it clear that these sacrifices are made willingly, out of a sense of duty, love for their country.
It's a good reminder that behind all the strategies and the politics, there are individuals who believe in what they're doing, their motivations run deep.
And it wasn't just about combat either. He highlighted the Indian Army's role in disaster relief, humanitarian aid. It speaks to their commitment to serving the people, even in times of peace.
He also touched on the issue of local support for militants. Acknowledging the factors that contribute to it, but also emphasizing that the vast majority of Indian citizens are patriotic and they support the army.
He did, and he told this great story about encountering these young boys playing with toy guns, pretending to be soldiers. He was really struck by their enthusiasm, their admiration. It's kind of a hopeful image, isn't it?
It is. It suggests that even amidst conflict, there's hope for the future.
It brings us back to that idea of mandatory military service, that shared experience fostering national unity, instilling values.
It's definitely thought-provoking. It makes us consider the role of the military in society and how those shared experiences, especially ones as intense as military service, can really shape a nation.
This whole interview has been eye-opening. We've learned so much about the Indian Army, their challenges, their mindset.
What stands out to you the most?
I think, for me, it's the human element. It's easy to get lost in the big picture, the geopolitical analysis. But Colonel Kanwar's stories bring it back down to earth. These are real people with complex motivations, facing immense challenges, making incredible sacrifices. His insights have given me a lot to think about.
Me too. I'm left thinking about the future of India's relationship with China, the impact of those experiences on Colonel Kanwar himself, and the potential implications of his ideas. It's clear that the Indian Army story, like any nation's military history, is full of courage, sacrifice, unwavering dedication. And it's stories like his that help us appreciate the weight of that.
Well said. I think that's a great place to wrap things up. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. And to all our listeners, as always, thank you for listening.